Hey, nice to see you again. This is Richard Sachs on Lost Arts Radio. This is Lost Arts Radio Live for the 7th day of March in 2020. And we've got a lot going on. Most of the attention on the news during the week, as I'm sure you guys know, is on the whole coronavirus situation. You probably didn't hear it, but I was just introducing you to everybody. And am I right that you're the founder and president of the Institute of Health Research?
I'm the president of it. It was actually founded by Dr. Podell and Karen Horvath, and I was the third trustee. And when they both retired, I guess I inherited the presidency.
Okay, all right. Sounds great. Well, our time's going to go really fast. And so what I told people you would be doing was giving them a little bit of context, to the current pandemic by looking at previous ones in the relatively recent past. And anything that you'd like to educate us about, those that would give us more understanding of what's happening now and what the pattern looks like.
Are you recording this, or is it?
Yeah, we're recording and we're broadcasting live.
All right. I would love to do this in the other room where I can get at some information.
Sure.
But it's probably. Let me see where. If I can even remember where I'm going to be able to get it. No, let's start. I think I have enough memory here that I can do it. I don't think we need to, for example, give folks a list of the great pandemics of the past 2,000 years. Let it suffice to say that approximately every 500 to 700 years, there is a major pandemic that rages through Eurasia. And now in the modern world, of course, with Eurasia being connected to the New World and places in between, there are no barriers to pandemics, although there is some evidence that even the Black Plague managed to spread into the New World at one point. So we can tell you that approximately every 700 years, there has been a serious plague that has ravaged the human race. Of course, we all know of the Great Plague, the Black Death of 1346, but it was about 700 years before that, the plague of Justinian, and about 700 years before that, there was another plague, basically during the Roman Republic period. In each case, between a quarter and a third, and possibly up to a half, of the human population of Eurasia died within 1 or 2 years. And that's an important thing to remember. 700 years after the Black Death, and remember the Black Death and the plague came back and back and back all the way during the 1300s through the 1700s until really the modern era, when modern hygiene, sanitation, and of course nutrition made a big difference in human living conditions and the human immune system. Prior to the attack on our immune system that is represented most obviously by environmental toxins and vaccine-induced toxins. But about 700 years after 1346 brings us to 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. There was no great plague in the middle of the 19th century, but in the beginning of the 20th century, of course, we had the first, if you will, cooked up pandemic, the great 1918, 1919 influenza that killed more people than World War I killed. Here in the United States, 500,000 Americans died in those 2 years, while only 50,000 Americans were killed on the battlefields of World War I. And it is instructive to look at the great pandemic that began the 20th century in order to understand a little more about the nature of pandemics. And I say it was the first manufactured or weaponized pandemic in human history, although we do have examples of, for example, Native Americans being given...
that was a smallpox situation, right?
Being given smallpox-infected blankets and trade goods in order specifically to kill them. It was population control. However, what happened in 1918 is quite instructive. We start with the fact that the United States was ramping up its involvement in World War I, and hundreds of thousands of Americans were being trained for the military. They were being trained generally out in the Midwest and in the Plain States at a series of Army bases. These were basic training bases, and very similar. They're the same ones were basically used a couple of decades later in World War II. But in World War I, two very interesting things happened at one time. A group of these soldiers, large group of them, were given a so-called experimental live virus flu vaccine. And at the same time, when they came down with the reactions to the flu vaccine, namely fevers and things like that, they were given the new miracle drug, aspirin, to control the fevers. The soldiers who had then been exposed to a live flu virus were loaded onto trains with their horses and with the pigs and chickens that would be slaughtered to feed them. And all of these mammals in close quarters were shipped out to South Carolina, where again, it was noted that these soldiers were recovering from the vaccine reactions, and everybody, horses, pigs, cows, soldiers, were all loaded onto these transport ships, which took several weeks to cross the Atlantic Ocean to Spain, where the American soldiers were offloaded and put onto basically live fire type drills. They were actually exposed, among other things, to mustard gas as part of their training to prepare them for the battlefields of World War I. Within weeks, this terrible flu epidemic broke out in Spain, the famous Spanish flu. The American soldiers began dying. They would get sick, begin to recover slightly with the aspirin, and then drop dead. It was noted during that time period that it was quite strange that the flu normally killed off young children and old people, but this flu was killing people off in the prime of life. So if you wanted to cook up a very dangerous influenza, you would be essentially cooking it up by mixing together a live virus vaccine with all sorts of other mammals that can cook up interesting recombinations of the same viruses. And then you would subject the people to all sorts of stresses, like being jammed together in a ship and being put to war games on the plane, on the plains of Madrid or wherever it might have been, subjecting them to actually mustard gas. So you add it all up, and it's no wonder that the great flu pandemic of 1918, 1919 killed all those people. It's almost inevitable that that sort of thing should happen. It's almost inevitable that China's one bioweapons level 4 laboratory would be in Wuhan, and they would be testing out coronavirus weaponization on a certain species of bat. And some of those bats would end up in the so-called wet market in Wuhan. And all of a sudden, we have a worldwide pandemic being triggered. Was it intentional? Did the Chinese government do it to test out the potency of the weapon? Was it unintentional? Because let me tell you, no matter how careful you are at these things, nobody is ever careful enough. Or did someone in the resistance release it in order to possibly bring down the Communist Party? I'm not sure, but I can tell you that we know. But these are among the possibilities of what's just happened. So that's a sort of nutshell history, if you will, of the great pandemics that rushed through Eurasia and have had such an important impact on human species. And it's not just the pandemics themselves, but there is an interesting theory that compares Eurasia on one hand with its climate bands that run from east to west all the way across the continent, to the climate bands of Africa and North and South America, which also run north and east and west, but they run through continents that are essentially oriented north and south. And so, for example, while the domestication of certain animals in Eurasia took literally a generation or so to spread across the entire continent, it took 1,000 years for domestications to spread in North and South America. The same thing applies to diseases. The diseases of Eurasia were constantly sloshing about and the populations of Eurasia were becoming immune to them, while the populations of North America, South America, and Africa were not becoming immune to these viruses. And of course, we know from history that literally, as the conquistadors were coming into the New World, their diseases were rushing ahead of them and decimating the populations. The Mississippi Valley, which had millions of Native Americans living in it, in villages and towns and ceremonial centers, was basically emptied by the time DeSoto was going up the Mississippi River and noting that there were these empty villages in wreck. The Aztec Empire suffered a great plague just before Cortez, and the Incas suffered a great plague just before the conquistadors.
Well, so how did it get to them if it was before because Europeans came over?
Because explorers and traders and and people are just moving around. It's not just the armies that are moving around. It's the people who are hanging on and moving ahead. And yes, it does appear that the disease literally travels faster than the army does. And so that's another important point to note of the way these interactions happen. And today, with our modern transportation, it's even more so. For example, that ship that's now off the coast of San Francisco.
Right.
It went from San Francisco to Hawaii and back, nowhere near the areas where COVID is becoming pandemic. Yet there was a person who had been in Asia, who was in Hawaii, who has the virus, and some people on the ship came off the ship in Hawaii and somehow picked up the virus and brought it back to the ship. And now 27 people on the ship have tested positive, and they're going to take the big mistake of quarantining everyone on the ship, which means that everybody on the ship is eventually going to get it. Right. This particular virus is extremely virulent. That is, it is easy to catch it. If you have a suppressed immune system, and who doesn't these days, if you have a suppressed immune system and you're anywhere exposed to it, you are going to pick it up. And it's going to, and unlike Ebola and the common flu, which actually shows symptoms before or as people become contagious, this particular coronavirus does not show symptoms while people have become contagious, but only days after they become contagious. And therefore, it is much easier to spread. So we have modern communications spreading it. We have the theories, these ideas of somehow pulling people into a quarantine station and jamming them together so they all get sick as something that makes sense, which it doesn't. Quarantining at home, it's called self-sheltering or sheltering at home, is a far safer thing to do for people who might have symptoms. It is even crazier that the CDC saying, if you've had your flu vaccine and have flu-like symptoms, you probably have COVID-19, as though the flu vaccine worked. By the way, this is the very year when the CDC also admitted that it was no more than 20% effective. So now
you said that if you've had the flu shot,
right, and you have symptoms, you can assume it's COVID. Well, actually, you can assume it's the flu because
the regular flu, right? Because it couldn't be anything else. Okay.
Well, it could be COVID, of course, but the interesting part is that the flu vaccine, if it's effective at all, and that's a good question, the CDC says it's only 18 to 20% effective, which means it's less than 50-50. I mean, you might as well roll the dice and see what happens. So we have this strange thing going on where the public health authorities are doing all the wrong steps. Some of the things they're doing are worse than nothing. What they should be doing, and some of the things they're doing are correct. Wash your hands and all that stuff is good. We know that it was improved nutrition, hygiene, and sanitation that ended the great epidemic diseases of earlier centuries. Clearly, I can show you charts that show 90% reductions in all of those diseases, whether it was smallpox or typhus or scarlet fever or diphtheria. The same downward curve throughout the 19th century. And then you look at the same charts and see where vaccines were first introduced for those various diseases, and you see that the actual decline leveled off at that point and went down slower. And by the way, for the diseases that never had a vaccine, like scarlet fever, the exact same curve
thing. Yeah.
On those charts, very instructive charts. And we now see, when you look very closely at the measles record, a series of sine waves running through the record now, where it peaks and goes down and peaks and goes down as the measles become more adapted to the various vaccine forms. And so, of course, none of the vaccines really stopped the diseases. What stopped the diseases were, as I said, nutrition, hygiene, and sanitation. And what will protect people from COVID-19 are the same things. And of course, in my opinion, the most powerful piece of immune system stimulation that you can use is nanosilver. Now, of course, vitamin D3 is essential, and vitamin C is essential, and N-acetylcysteine, NAC, very powerful and useful. But most of all, it's nanosilver. Nanosilver is really important. And of course, my good friend, Dr. Rima Lebo, MD, strongly recommends nanosilver, and you can get the nanosilver she recommends if you go to her shopping cart, which is at www.nsf. That's Natural Solutions Foundation, right? nsfmarketplace.com. Very important place. So what do we have here? We have a situation in which, so we've talked a little bit about this issue of the history of pandemics and what's going on right here and right now. And those are good things to talk about. But let's also talk about the history of martial law in America, because a lot of people are talking about martial law. Yeah. They're really concerned that there's going to be forced vaccination in a year or so when the vaccine is available. And by the way, the latest announcement that I saw today was that the Chinese claim they will have a valid and working vaccine within a month. Now, that's, of course, impossible. It will not be a working vaccine. No vaccine really works. But it will be very dangerous, because it will not.
And it could be that quick, because what I had heard, Ralph, is that one had been patented before the outbreak of the virus.
The U.S. government actually owns a patent. Yes.
Yeah. How can you patent something that's not already developed? So maybe they had it developed already. You know.
Indeed. Maybe this is a weaponized disease that either got out of hand or was live tested and that got out of hand, or somebody in the resistance decided to pull a 13th monkey on us and release it into Wuhan. The world will long remember the wet meat market in Wuhan, I am sure. We should all remember that there are consequences to what we do, and there are consequences to the twists and turns of our cultures.
Right.
But let's talk a little bit about this issue of can we expect armed agents of the public health authorities to come to our doorsteps with needles? Is that likely to happen? Is there? And you remember, the Public Health Service is a uniformed service. We have a Surgeon General and other persons with military rank and actually wear military uniforms on dress occasions. And right. So we can talk about this in the context of martial law. We have examples of martial law in U.S. history, and we also have the limitations on martial law that are clearly set out in the history of our legal system. And so if I begin with reference to the U.S. Constitution, well, actually, let's go back a step further. Let's begin with the Declaration of Independence. And let's remember the Declaration includes, of course, general statements about human rights, and general statements about the nature of government and its limitations. And then it goes on, and in a whole large section, it lists all of the evil things that the King of England and his minions have done to the American people, and justifying, of course, independence. And among those evil things were basically imposing martial law. The city of Boston was taken over by the British military and lived under martial law until the Revolutionary Army forced the British Army out. The city of New York was taken over by the British military and lived under martial law, and people were executed in a, as they say, at a drumhead court without judicial process. So the American people were very much aware when the Constitution was written about the nature of martial law. And nowhere in the Constitution is the federal government of the United States given authority to declare martial law. In fact, we know from the way the Constitution is written that unless it is explicitly in there, it is not a power of the central government. Now, there is a reference in the Constitution to the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. The writ of habeas corpus is an ancient writ. A writ is a formal court document, right? It's an ancient writ that says basically by a judge to a government agent, bring me the body, habeas corpus, have me the body.
Yeah.
And the body is a person who's being held by the government under some manner of duress. And it's the most powerful writ of all because it says no matter who you are, whether you're the king's agent or the president's agent, if as a judge, I am telling you, bring the person before me that we may decide whether you may lawfully hold this person. And the person must be physically brought before the court. The Constitution says the writ can be suspended. And indeed, during the Civil War, it was suspended. But let me tell you that the courts made some decisions about that are significant. But before we get to that, let's remind everyone that the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus does not suspend your legal rights. Indeed, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, were adopted after the Constitution and after the habeas corpus clause, which means that those amendments amend the habeas corpus clause. If it ever allowed the government to cut short our rights, it did not do so after the Bill of Rights was adopted.
Okay, let me ask you one question interjected in there, Ralph, and that's just to be clear on the habeas corpus issue. You said, bring me the body or have me the body. Is that the body of the accused or the body of evidence that has to be seen to make charges?
No, it is the person. The actual person must be brought before the judge. The judge has to see the living person.
In order to make charges or to do what?
In order to justify the government holding that person.
Okay.
And the government has the burden of proof that it has the legal right to hold that person. So
well, then how can they issue the orders that say go arrest somebody, issuing an arrest warrant when they typically don't have the person?
That's the basis for the arrest in the first place, is the arrest warrant. A judge signs the warrant. You can't arrest someone without a judge. And the judge signs the warrant, and then the person is brought before the judge to justify the seizure. And if they've been seized without judicial process, the same process allows the court to force the government to produce the body. Now, during the Civil War, a lot of people were arrested and held without due process of law. And that was done by the federal government, even though the Constitution says you can't do that. And there were cases that came up to the Supreme Court after the war. And the famous case is the Mulligan Case. And the court held basically that you can only have martial law literally on the battlefield. You can only have that drumhead court, that the officers meeting and hanging people on an actual battlefield. That so long as the civil courts are capable of meeting, there can be no martial law. Clear decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. My question is, if we are ordered to close all of our courts and public places because of a pandemic, does that now apply? Or can we be subject to martial law because the civil courts no longer are capable of meeting? This is a very troubling issue that needs to be considered. Right. And I was interviewing Larry B. Kraft, Counsel B. Kraft, who is, in my estimation, the dean of the Patriot lawyers, certainly one of the great Patriot lawyers of our era. And just yesterday on this issue, and we are both very troubled about it. And it would be really good if people could organize a team of lawyers to be ready to test this in court, probably by going into the Federal Circuit Court in Washington, D.C. and trying to get an appellate division decision as soon as possible. That will take some
before
money.
They say before the courts are stopped from operating, obviously.
Exactly. You got it. And it's my hope that Chief Justice Roberts will make the decision that the courts can operate electronically, and the judge can be at home. Skype. It's over Skype.
Yeah, exactly. It's working at the moment. So I think there's another issue though, that really needs to be looked at that wasn't apparently thought of by the founders, and that's that the federal government, and sometimes, in many cases, the state governments too, but the federal government for sure, has established the traditional habit now of delegating powers that it doesn't have to agencies that don't have a constitutional basis to exist. Some of those are called health agencies. And it's also made agreements voluntarily on behalf of the people to join a supranational organization that then has rules that the members by default agree to, and they basically become the government if the right kind of emergency is declared.
We do have laws in the U.S. Constitution that says that the treaties and laws made pursuant to the Constitution are the law of the land. And among those treaties are the treaties that established the World Health Organization. Yes. But of course, it's the treaties and made in accordance with the Constitution. The federal government could not make a treaty that would violate the First or Second Amendment. To do so would be to violate the First or Second Amendment.
So the problem is they already did that. And by joining these organizations, they agree to give up the First, Fourth, Fifth, 10th, and other amendments. And that's the agreement that they voluntarily made on our behalf. The fact that it's unconstitutional, I don't think that's been brought up so far. I mean, not
it hasn't been tested, but it can't be tested until they actually try to shut down websites, for the government, not private people shutting them down. I mean, unfortunately, we have a situation where we have a tremendous private censorship going on. Although I personally believe that those folks who are using our internet public utility for commercial purposes and are then restricting our speech over that public utility are acting as agents of government power. They're acting under color of law, and they should be bound by the same First Amendment that the government is bound by, because they are alter egos for the government in that context.
Right.
And I believe that it's really important to make sure that the public roads, as it were, are available to all people to use. And the public paid for the roads, and we should have access to them, and that includes the internet highway, as it were. Which is to me a type of common ground or commons held for everyone's benefit. And while you can use the commercial benefit, you should not be able to restrict people just because you disagree with their speech. That's to me an important factor. So let's talk a little bit about how the mandates might be implemented. The federal government doesn't go around with agents with needles, sticking them in people's bodies. They actually go about and use the state governments for that. And it will be the state governments that will be going from door to door, perhaps. And we have some cases about that. We have a very important case from 2013. And that case is Missouri versus McNeely. Get the right order there. And in that case, McNeely got into a one-car accident. He slammed into a tree or something like that, and he was rushed to an emergency room. And as he's being wheeled in on the gurney, strapped to the gurney, the police officer on one side of him is saying to the orderly on the other side, "I want you to get his blood right away. I want to see how much alcohol he's got." And McNeely is saying, and I imagine in a slurred voice, "Don't take my blood. I don't consent." Well, they take his blood, they arrest him for drunk driving, and convict him. And his appeal gets up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Wow. I don't know how. I would love to know how. That was some really great lawyering, And the Supreme Court says the police officer could have picked up a phone, gotten a local judge within moments, and could have gotten that judge to issue a search warrant allowing them to take the blood without the individual's consent. It could have been done within minutes. And he didn't do it, and McNeely did not consent. And hold on one second, Kathy, I'm on a radio show. Okay, very good. I'm back, folks. And he didn't consent, and therefore the taking of his blood was unlawful. Or as the court said, and this is an almost exact quote, "We have never wavered from our commitment that the individual has a protected privacy interest in preventing an agent of the state from piercing the skin. So can a government agent go to your door with a needle? Not according to McNeely. There was a subsequent case, by the way, last year, where the person was unconscious and couldn't say, "I refuse to consent." And the court said it was okay to take that person's blood because they didn't refuse to consent. Unless you assert your right of informed consent, the right will be deemed waived. That's the most important legal point I can raise in this podcast is unless you assert your right, it is deemed waived. You must assert it. How do you assert your right of informed consent? Well, that leads us to the issue of what is informed consent. And in order to do that, we have to talk about a couple of cases. We have to talk about the 1905 case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which is the case in which the Supreme Court said it's okay for a state government to fine you $5. In those days, $5, 5 silver dollars would be about $100 today. Mm-hmm. And it's okay to fine you if you do not get a vaccine during a declared pandemic. They didn't say it's okay to stick a needle in your arm against your will, right? They said it's okay to fine you. And then they went on and they said, however, the courts are not without power to intervene if it can be shown with probability that this person is not a fit subject for vaccination, or that the vaccination may cause harm or probably death. And that, of course, was 1905, before we really knew how dangerous vaccines were. In the subsequent decades, our courts have held that vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. And so we are in a situation where, in order to force you to be vaccinated, it would seem to me that a judge has to have a hearing, has to find out about your health, and has to decide whether you're a fit subject to vaccination, or you have to volunteer. If you say, I don't consent, they have to get that sort of judicial process. Now, a few years after Jacobson is another famous case decided by Judge Cardozo, who was a New York State judge at the time, later became a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And that case was about a doctor who engaged in a medical intervention without the informed consent of the patient. And the court held that to do so is a trespass, an assault and battery, subjects the doctor to liability in tort, even if the person is not harmed by the intervention. So long as it was without consent, it's an assault and battery. And that's been the law ever since.
Okay, what interaction is there between that decision and precedent and what was signed in 1986 under Reagan?
It's considered the leading case in informed consent in the United States, the first case. And of course, a half a century later, at the end of World War II, were the famous Nuremberg Trials, where the chief Nazi war criminals were tried and punished. And after the Nuremberg Trials themselves, the International Tribunal was done, there were a series of what are called the subsequent Nuremberg Trials. Among those subsequent Nuremberg Trials, which were held by the United States as occupying power, was the famous Nazi doctors trial. And for the Nazi doctors trial, the U.S. prosecutors team, which, by the way, was led by a member of the U.S. Supreme Court who's on leave of absence for the purpose of being a prosecutor, they prepared a document called the Nuremberg Code. And the Nuremberg Code was a statement of the existing law of informed consent. And it said that the voluntary informed consent of the subject of any medical intervention is absolutely necessary, that no element of coercion may be used to force anyone to undergo any medical intervention. And it was on the basis of that Nuremberg Code that the Nazi doctors were tried and some of them hung. The law is clear. And the same language, that paragraph about no element of coercion, has been taken up and is in United States laws. There's something called an Institutional Review Board law, which says that any experiments must go through institutional review boards, and the board's job is to make sure that informed consent is real. And then the UN Bioethics Convention uses the same language as well. Clearly, international law is set and settled. You have a right to informed consent, but if you do not assert that right, the right may be deemed waived. will be deemed waived. Silence is consent. Now, if you want to assert your right to informed consent, one of the best ways of doing that is with what is called an advance medical directive. It's a medical will or goes by a number of different terms, and it doesn't have to be a single document. For example, we know people who have cards on them that say, I am a diabetic, as a warning, or
Right.
I do not accept transfusions, people who are Jehovah's Witnesses. I do not accept transfusions. We've prepared a card, the Advanced Vaccine Directive card, which asserts your legal right to refuse vaccination. And if you want to get one of those cards and learn about it, you can go to this website. It's www.tinyurl, that's TINYURL, tinyurl.com/AVD, Alpha Victor David, AVD card, AVD being Advanced Vaccine Directive. It says, I do not consent, and it should be in your wallet. The general rule is if you present at an emergency room and you're not conscious, they're supposed to look through your wallet, your pocketbook or whatever to see if you have any medical warning cards. I'm a diabetic. I'm allergic to penicillin. I refuse all vaccines. And they're supposed to note that on your chart. So that would overcome the case where the person is unconscious and can't object because it's right there. And so, again, tinyurl.com/AVD card. That's an important weapon in your arsenal of protection from the potential for martial law during a declared pandemic. So
I think one of the big questions in this particular case is going to be based on the idea that the U.S. government has declared a certain state of emergency. That already happened a while ago with respect to this particular pandemic. And the U.S. is a member of the WHO, and it has also empowered the CDC to set aside certain constitutional rights if they declare a certain level of emergency. So when that happens and they're dealing with millions of people, obviously before every one of them can get into a court situation, what's the practical reality of what's about to happen with that when it's not the governments per se that enforce these things on their own, but only as agents under the CDC, which is under the WHO, supposedly?
This will have to be tested in court. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
People are going to be ready to resist. Larry B. Kraft said there are only two ways of resisting this sort of imposition. One is by taking up arms, which the Second Amendment gives us the right to do, and the other is by petitioning the courts, which the First Amendment gives us the right to do. They keep on not mentioning that. The First Amendment bundles together freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances.
Yeah. Now, what bothers me about that clause in the First Amendment is it gives you the right to do petitions. It doesn't tell them they have to respond.
The courts have held that the right of petition for redress applies to all levels of government. And no, they don't have to respond. But if you bring a petition before a court, there's a procedure. And the courts, and so that's the place to go. A petition to the president is something that doesn't have to be responded to. A petition to Congress, likewise. But a petition to the court, properly presented, is a legal action. And the courts will, one hopes anyway.
So this is a really important time for attorneys with courage and principles to actually try to help the people maintain their constitutionally recognized rights, I would imagine, right?
And one of those great lawyers that's doing that is Patty Finn of Rockland County, New York, the good health lawyer. She's done a great job. She is the first of the lawyers in New York to actually get an injunction against New York's draconian school vaccine law. And she did it within the context of what is called the learned intermediary, which is something you folks should hear about. The physician is the learned intermediary between the healthcare system and the individual. And what New York State tried to do when it abolished religious exemptions was to so restrict the doctor as learned intermediary that there would be no medical exemptions either. And in this particular case,
Right.
the court issued an injunction because the government refused to accept the physician's decision as a learned intermediary that this particular child, who absolutely had the genetic markings of a person who would have an adverse reaction, this person was not a fit subject for vaccination. But unless you have a previous anaphylactic reaction to a previous vaccination, you can't get an exemption under the rules the way the New York State bureaucracy adopted them. The statute that was adopted didn't say that, but the rules that were adopted restricted the medical exemptions to only the list that the CDC has, which is essentially only anaphylactic shock.
Right.
Now, we have another government agency, the Institutes of Medicine, that Congress authorized to review vaccine safety, in fact, required it to do so. And the IOM has issued a series of reports, which the CDC has ignored, which list all of the adverse reactions that have been proven to vaccination. And it's a lot more than anaphylactic shock, let me tell you. We have two different government bureaucracies who are saying different things.
Right.
Who do you trust? Who do you trust?
We have enough material for many more shows. Let me ask you something for a really short answer, because we've got about 1 minute left here. Is what happened in Samoa relevant to our lessons at all here? Because there they did go door to door. They jailed people who spoke out in favor of vitamins and things like that, put them in prison for false information, and forced everybody to have a medical treatment without consent. Is that relevant to what we're talking about?
Yes, it is. And the important difference is that we have a Constitution here, and a Second Amendment and a First Amendment. I have the right to associate or not associate. I have the right to say no. And we really have to remember that there's a little bit of American exceptionalism left. And unless we end that at every step of the way, at every instance, they will remove our rights slice by slice. You know, and all I can tell people is be careful, be prepared, be ready to self-shield at home. And make sure you have plenty of nano silver and assert your rights. If you do not assert your right, it is deemed waived. If you do assert your right
that's important,
to informed consent and are forced nonetheless, well, you probably have a legal action for damages at the very least.
We have a lot more to talk about.
You're done. All right. My pleasure always to be with you, and let's talk again soon.
Yeah, we will, Ralph. Thank you. Have a good night.